EMTT Sloan stood at the front of the modest chapel, his hand shaking slightly as he tugged at the collar of his finest shirt for what felt like the 100th time. The place was nearly deserted, just the preacher and two acquaintances he had hired as witnesses. He had never laid eyes on the woman who was about to become his wife. He didn't know her voice, hadn't asked for her photograph, and had only pieced together her personality through letters that hinted at loneliness and a longing for companionship. Nothing prepared him for the reality of the woman who would soon share his name. A rhythmic thudding echoed across the wooden floor, deliberate and unyielding. EMTT's breath caught in his throat as the chapel doors creaked open. A figure stood framed by the morning light outside. Slowly, as his eyes adjusted, he saw her in full. Nora Harrow, towering nearly a foot above him, filled the doorway with a presence that seemed to command the space. Her broad shoulders and solid frame made him feel almost fragile, and his mind scrambled. How had he imagined her? Why had he assumed she'd be small and delicate, like the other women he had known? The preacher cleared his throat, breaking EMTT out of his astonishment. Nora stepped forward, her posture poised yet betraying a subtle quiver in her hands. Despite her imposing appearance, he recognized the same trepidation he felt mirrored in her eyes. Fear, raw and human, lingered there as though they had both been standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if they could take the leap. Whatever had driven them both to agree to a marriage with a complete stranger was now laid bare: necessity, desperation, and a willingness to risk vulnerability. 3 weeks earlier, EMTT had been alone in his kitchen, staring at a letter that would shift the trajectory of his life. The ranch was unervingly quiet, only the wind whispering through the wooden shutters. He had written to a matchmaking agency in a moment of deep solitude, seeking someone who might understand the isolation that accompanied owning land far from neighbors. The reply had arrived sooner than anticipated, penned with careful, deliberate handwriting. Her name was Nora Harrow, and the words spoke of a woman acquainted with hard work, with silence, with solitude. She wrote of cooking for one, of sunsets observed alone, of missing the sound of another human presence. She said nothing of her appearance, and he had never asked. In his mind, she had been slight, gentle, someone whose hands would slip into his with ease. Now, as she approached the altar, those illusions shattered. Her movements radiated self-assurance, as if she had never needed anyone to reach high shelves or offer assistance. Her gown was simple but finely crafted, tailored to her imposing frame. When she reached his side, she tilted her head down to meet his gaze, and a warmth flushed his cheeks. The preacher's voice began the ritual, and EMTT struggled to focus on the familiar words. He kept sneaking glances at Nora, trying to reconcile the letters he had read with the woman standing beside him. Her hands were neatly clasped, her face unreadable, and yet he could sense something unspoken in her eyes. When the preacher invited objections, silence lingered uncomfortably, stretching the moment taut. MTT felt her tension, and he wondered if she wrestled with the same doubts he did. There was more behind her gaze than uncertainty. Beneath it, a hidden story, a deeper reason she had agreed to this leap into a union with a stranger. As they prepared to exchange vows, Nora faced him fully for the first time. Her voice was unexpectedly soft, almost a whisper. "There's something I need you to know before we proceed." The preacher paused, uncomfortable, eager to finish the ceremony and collect his fee. MTT's heart thudded as he waited, knowing whatever she disclosed could either cement or shatter their fledgling marriage. Her previously steady hands now betrayed a faint tremor as she spoke, eyes cast downward. "I've never been married," she admitted, voice fragile. "But I have been engaged twice." The words landed like a stone in his chest. 2 men had once sought her hand, and both engagements had failed. His mind spun, imagining countless possibilities, none reassuring. Did she leave them, or did they leave her? There was a careful precision in her tone, a subtle hint that more lay beneath. MTT found his voice, raspy and uneven. "What happened?" Nora flinched slightly, as though surprised he would press for truth rather than walk away. She glanced toward the chapel doors for an instant, a fleeting thought of escape passing across her expression. Then she squared her shoulders and met his gaze. "The first one left," she said quietly, the weight of years evident in her calm, measured delivery. "He changed his mind about wanting a wife after seeing me for the first time. The second engagement lasted only through the party." Her confession hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. MTT's thoughts tumbled, trying to reconcile the strong, imposing woman before him with the fragility and past disappointments she had quietly endured. Both stood there, vulnerable in ways that no letter could have captured, poised on the brink of a decision that would define the rest of their lives. The weight of truth, of past failure, and of mutual fear pressed against them, but beneath it simmered something unspoken, the faint glimmer of understanding that perhaps, together, they could find something neither had dared to imagine alone. Emmett adjusted his shirt nervously, hands trembling as he tried to straighten the wrinkles for the third time. The church, quiet and sparsely furnished, seemed to press in on him, amplifying the tension in the empty space. The preacher shifted uncomfortably behind the pulpit, clearing his throat, but neither Emmett nor Nora responded. Their silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and lingering fears. Emmett studied Nora closely, noticing the careful way she carried herself, the way she braced as though anticipating a rejection similar to the ones that had haunted her in the past. She had journeyed countless miles to marry a man she had never met, carrying the weight of humiliation inflicted by others. Emmett's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the letters that had built a delicate image of her with the reality standing before him. "Why didn't you mention any of this in your letters?" he asked gently, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Nora's response was a soft, bitter laugh that carried no amusement. "Would you have agreed to marry me if I had described myself honestly? If I told you I am 6 feet tall and strong enough to lift a man off his feet?" Her frankness startled him. Most women he had known approached delicate truths with careful circumspection, but Nora had none of that hesitation. The sensible course would have been to halt the ceremony, to admit that the reality before them did not match their expectations. But something in her eyes held him back. She wasn't merely questioning whether he could accept her size. She was asking if he could recognize her worth beyond superficial judgments. She wanted to be seen as more than a series of misfortunes, more than a woman deemed too large for love. In that moment, Emmett realized he, too, had a confession. Drawing a deep breath, Emmett let the words escape before fear could silence him. "I didn't ask for a photograph of you because I was afraid you'd want to see mine," he admitted, his chest tightening with the weight of honesty. Nora's brows lifted in curiosity, prompting him to continue. "I'm not exactly the man most women picture as a husband. I'm barely 5'6". I stutter when I'm nervous, and I've never kissed anyone before." His cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he pressed on. "Most people ignore me. Those who do notice me often treat me like a child wandering off from his mother." Nora's expression softened, understanding dawning across her face. "You were afraid I would refuse you," she said quietly. "It wasn't a question of my choice," Emmett admitted with a nod, his voice faltering. In that quiet moment, two souls who had endured rejection finally glimpsed each other without pretense. The preacher, growing impatient, cleared his throat and suggested postponing the ceremony. But Nora shook her head resolutely. "We've both traveled too far to turn back now," she said, meeting his gaze with newfound clarity. Emmett's eyes lingered on her face, noting the strength and warmth beneath the surface he had initially overlooked. "You still want to do this?" he asked. Nora nodded, and relief flickered in her features. "Then let's do it properly," she said, reaching for his hands. Her fingers, roughened by hard work, were warm and steady. In her touch, Emmett felt neither diminished nor small. For the first time, a woman was choosing him knowing exactly who he was. The ceremony resumed, though Emmett's attention was fixed on Nora's eyes, free from pity or condescension. When it came time to exchange rings, panic hit him. He had spent weeks obsessing over every detail, but completely forgotten the rings. His pockets were empty, and he felt the flush of shame rise. Nora noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she whispered, concern flickering across her face. The preacher paused, expectant, but Emmett struggled to speak. "I forgot the rings," he admitted, voice barely above a murmur. But instead of anger, Nora laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to fill the empty church. "Don't worry," she said, reaching into her bag. "I brought a backup." From within, she produced a simple worn gold band. "It belonged to my grandmother. She always said it brought luck to whoever wore it next." Emmett stared at the ring, then at her. Her gesture was not accusatory but pragmatic, a reflection of a woman who had learned to face disappointment prepared. It lasted 43 years on her finger. "If it survived them, it can survive us," she said softly. Touched, Emmett glanced at his own hands. "But what about me?" "I have nothing to give you," he murmured. Nora's gaze fell on her own bare finger, then back at his face. "I haven't worn jewelry in years," she admitted, and most rings wouldn't even fit me. He looked at her hands, really looked for the first time, appreciating the strength and elegance entwined in them. That's not right, he said quietly. Every bride deserves a ring. Ignoring the preacher's sharp throat clearing, Emmett began removing his father's signet ring from his pinky, a symbol of his own humility and devotion, ready to make this imperfect moment theirs together. The ring was tiny, almost delicate, far too small for the average hand, yet perfectly suited to his slender fingers. This belonged to my father, he murmured, extending it toward her. It's all I have of real value apart from the ranch. It was a simple silver band, etched with a faint, intricate design, polished smooth from years of wear. Nora's gaze lingered on it, a mixture of awe and disbelief. I can't accept this, she whispered. But before she could protest further, he gently took her hand. The ring slipped onto her finger, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They exchanged a stunned glance. It seems made for you, he said softly. The preacher wasted no time, sensing the momentum. By the authority granted to me, I now declare you husband and wife, he intoned, his voice echoing off the empty wooden walls. When he added, you may kiss the bride, a wave of awkwardness hit them both. Neither had truly considered the moment. EMTT would need to stretch to reach her, and she would have to stoop low. Their height difference, which had never seemed so significant, now felt like a barrier. EMTT's confidence wavered as the preacher watched, expectant. Then Nora did something unexpected. She bent gracefully to one knee, meeting his eyes with serene composure. The sight took his breath away. Instead of highlighting their differences, she bridged them, offering him equality and understanding in one fluid motion. Better, she asked softly, her eyes level with his for the first time. Words failed him. When he leaned in, their lips met naturally, with warmth and authenticity, the brief kiss carrying more honesty than either had anticipated. She lingered in that position for a heartbeat longer, studying his face with quiet wonder. The preacher, relieved, snapped his book closed and handed MTT the marriage certificate. Congratulations, he said tersely, already preparing to leave. The witnesses signed their names, curious but polite, and soon the church emptied, leaving the newlyweds alone. The silence was heavy. He cleared his throat. I suppose we should head to the ranch, he stammered, his nerves returning now that the ceremony was over. Nora nodded, though a shadow of hesitation crossed her face. Then her voice cut through, serious and tense. Before we go anywhere, there's something you need to know. His stomach sank. He'd already faced surprises, her rejection history, her imposing presence, her cautious demeanor. What else was left? She moved to the window, staring out at the dusty street as though gathering strength. I'm running, she confessed, pausing as though each word cost her dearly. From someone, the admission hung between them, heavy and unsettling. EMTT's pulse quickened. Who? He asked cautiously, unsure if he wanted the answer. Her hands clenched at her sides, the tension rigid in her posture. My stepfather, she said finally. For 2 years, he's been trying to force me into a marriage with his business partner. When I resisted, he threatened to declare me legally incapable and seize control of what my mother left me. Her tone sharpened with every word. I had no choice but to disappear before he could act. MTT absorbed the revelation, the weight of it settling like ice in his veins. She hadn't merely sought companionship. She had sought safety, a shield from a man who would dominate her life. And now that threat might still be looming. The small church seemed smaller still, constricted by the reality of her confession. MTT looked at Nora, seeing her in a new light, not only as a woman whose size had once caused her doubt, but as someone pursued by real danger. How long do we have? He asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Relief flickered across her face at his practical response. I've covered my tracks as best I could, she admitted. But Jeremiah Blackwood has influence. If he's determined, he'll find me. The name meant little to him, but the way it rolled off her tongue made his skin prickle. What does he want with your inheritance? He asked, though he suspected the answer. Her laugh was tinged with bitterness. It's not only money, though that's part of it. My mother owned land bordering his property. He tried to buy it for years, but she refused. When she died, it passed to me. The silver ring you see, she touched it lightly, was part of what he wanted to control. He assumed he could bend me like he did her. MTT felt a surge of anger, raw and unfamiliar. He wasn't a man to clash with others over property or power, but this felt personal, wrong on every level. He looked at Nora, at the woman who had chosen to trust him, and knew that from this moment forward, protecting her would not be optional. It would be essential. EMTT's hands clenched at his sides as a surge of anger flared within him. The very idea of someone daring to threaten Nora sparked a violent instinct. She had married him not out of love, but to shield her inheritance from a man who would stop at nothing to seize it. The realization stung in a strange, unexpected way, not with resentment, but with a peculiar pride. She had chosen to trust him as a protector. I admit, Nora said quietly, her tone softening. It wasn't purely about defense. But mostly, yes. Her gaze met his, carrying a vulnerability that made his chest tighten. Your letters, Emmett, they were different. You wrote about the simple desire for companionship, sharing quiet nights, talking while working, living life together. You didn't mention chores, children, obligations. You wrote about feeling alone. She stepped closer, the honesty in her words cutting through the years of uncertainty. I felt that same emptiness. A shadow of dread passed over EMTT. Jeremiah Blackwood would not rest. Men like him, relentless and entitled, did not abandon pursuits, especially when property and wealth were involved. Nora's jaw firmed, determination replacing fear. He can't force me to leave my husband. That's why our marriage had to be official, documented. Real. Her eyes locked with his, intensity burning through her calm exterior. But you must know what you're stepping into. Jeremiah isn't just my stepfather. He's ruthless, accustomed to taking what he wants, no matter the cost. Before EMTT could respond, a thunder of hooves shook the ground outside. Nora's face went pale, her body stiffening. It's too soon, she whispered, tremor betraying her fear. There's no way he's found me this fast. EMTT went to the window, squinting against the afternoon sun. Dust rose on the horizon as 3 riders charged toward the church. The leader's posture radiated command. His expensive garments marked him as a man of wealth and influence. The others followed in unquestioning deference. Is that him? EMTT asked, though Nora's reaction answered the question. She backed away from the window as though her fear could make her invisible. How did he track us so quickly? The riders drew closer, voices carrying faintly on the wind, the thunder of hooves growing louder. EMTT's mind raced, weighing their options. He straightened, shoulders squared, and turned to Nora. Hide behind the altar. Let me face them first, he said, calm but resolute. Nora shook her head, the fear in her eyes hardening into defiance. No. Running is what put me here in the first place. If he wants a confrontation, he'll have it. The church doors slammed open, rattling the old hinges. Jeremiah Blackwood entered like a storm incarnate, dust streaking his luxurious coat, silver hair catching the light, eyes cold and calculating. Flanking him, 2 younger men exuded silent menace, muscle hired for intimidation. Nora, he called, his voice heavy with authority. You've led us on quite a pursuit. His gaze swept dismissively over EMTT before returning to Nora. I trust you enjoyed your little escapade, but it ends now. Come home and face your responsibilities. Nora stepped forward, shielding EMTT instinctively. I am home, she said firmly. This is my husband, Emmett Sloan. We have just been married. She held up her hand, the silver band gleaming in the sunlight. Jeremiah's laugh was sharp and bitter. Married to this boy? He sneered at EMTT. Do you truly think a hastily arranged ceremony changes anything? I possess documents proving her instability. This marriage is meaningless. EMTT felt a flush of embarrassment but refused to cower. Our marriage is valid. Nora is my wife, and her affairs are mine as well. His voice wavered only slightly, a minor crack in the storm, but enough to claim a small victory. One of Jeremiah's men chuckled, but Jeremiah silenced him with a raised hand. You don't understand. This is far bigger than a piece of land. Nora has cost me months of negotiation and thousands of dollars with her foolish defiance. The land belonged to my mother, Nora countered, voice steady though her hands trembled. She left it to me, not to you. You have no legal right. Jeremiah's face darkened, a storm behind his cold eyes. Legal rights can be contested. Papers can be amended. And when the law bends, it will bend in my favor. EMTT stepped closer to Nora, placing a steadying hand on her arm. We will face him together, he said softly but with unshakable resolve. No threats, no intimidation can undo what is ours. Jeremiah's gaze swept the church, calculating, dismissive, and yet tinged with irritation. Bold words. But boldness alone won't save you from reality. You may be legally married, boy, but in this world, power and wealth dictate terms, not sentiment. Nora's grip tightened on EMTT's hand, her stance unwavering. Then we will face reality together, she said. And we will not back down. Outside, the dust from the approaching riders swirled like a prelude to battle. The tension within the church was palpable, a dangerous quiet before the inevitable confrontation. EMTT and Nora, united not just by marriage but by trust and resolve, prepared to face the storm that Jeremiah Blackwood had brought with him. Jeremiah reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, the kind of document that carried the weight of power over someone else's life. I have official certification here, he said, his voice tight with smug authority. Nora Harrow has been deemed legally incapable of managing her own affairs. Signed by a physician, witnessed by a judge. This gives me control over everything she owns, including decisions about who she marries. Emmett studied the papers, a cold knot of recognition forming in his stomach. The trap Nora had been fleeing from was suddenly clear. With these documents, Jeremiah could seize her property, manipulate her, even arrange a marriage under his terms. But Emmett noticed a flaw, a detail Jeremiah hadn't considered. His voice was steady, quiet, but sharp as he spoke. Those papers refer to Nora Harrow, he said. But my wife, she's Nora Sloan now. You've got nothing. The tension in the room thickened immediately, crackling like a live wire. Jeremiah's cheeks flushed crimson with fury, his eyes narrowing into a dangerous glare. For a heartbeat, Emmett half expected a blow. Instead, the older man leaned forward, using his imposing bulk to dominate the space. You think you've outsmarted me, boy, he sneered. A name change doesn't matter when I can have this marriage annulled for fraud. Nora never told you about her condition, did she? Emmett's fear was gone now, replaced by a calm resolve he hadn't felt before. He met Jeremiah's glare without flinching. There's nothing wrong with her mind, he said, his voice steady. She's one of the strongest, most capable people I've ever known. But I'm beginning to question yours. What kind of man chases his stepdaughter across 3 states just to steal her inheritance? The words hit like a well-aimed arrow. Jeremiah's hand twitched toward his coat, and Emmett's instincts braced for whatever weapon might emerge. But Nora stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. Her full height, combined with a newfound air of authority, created an unyielding barrier between them. Enough, she said firmly, each word carrying weight. You've spoken your piece. Now leave us alone. Jeremiah's sneer wavered, uncertainty creeping into the edges of his anger. This isn't over, he spat, but his confidence was faltering. The papers he had relied on were meaningless now. The church setting, public and solemn, hadn't been part of his plan. I'll return with legal force that will make your marriage meaningless, he threatened. Then bring it, Nora said, her voice calm and unwavering. But remember, if you can't prove fraud or coercion, everything I own, including the authority over my mother's land, is now under my husband's protection. Emmett observed Jeremiah's expression as the truth settled in. By marrying Nora, he hadn't merely given her safety, he'd become a legal shield. Jeremiah could no longer rely on intimidation alone. Any attempt to manipulate Nora now meant confronting Emmett as well. This marriage is a sham, Jeremiah muttered, though the certainty in his tone had evaporated. And when I prove it, you'll both regret it. He turned toward the door, then paused, his voice dropping into a low, venomous threat. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I could ruin men like you for breakfast. Emmett squeezed Nora's hand, a quiet confidence threading his words. Maybe, he said, his voice low but firm. But you'll never understand what we have. We chose each other, and we'll face whatever comes together. Jeremiah left, his men trailing silently behind, obedient to his command. The church returned to a hushed stillness, yet it felt different now. The immediate threat had dissipated, but both Emmett and Nora knew this confrontation was only the beginning. He'll come back, Nora murmured, eyes fixed on the dusty road where the riders had vanished. He doesn't know how to give up. Emmett's hand tightened around hers, his gaze unwavering. Let him, he said. Whatever he brings, we'll face it as one. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of what they had just endured gave way to something stronger, an unspoken bond forged in defiance of danger, a partnership cemented not by desperation, but by choice. They were no longer two solitary souls bound by circumstance. They were a unit, prepared to confront any challenge, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. Even as the threat of Jeremiah's return lingered in the air, Emmett and Nora knew one undeniable truth. Their marriage was no longer a mere arrangement. It had become real, resilient, and unbreakable. And as the church doors closed behind them, a quiet certainty settled over them both. They had each other, and that was something no one could ever take away.